The biggest mistake most people make with money is not that they buy the wrong investment. It is that they try to buy the right investment at the wrong stage of life. That sounds like a small distinction. It is not. It is the whole thing. A man hears about index funds, rental properties, private equity, dividend stocks, cash flow, passive income, freedom, ownership, and all the other words that now float around the financial world like confetti at a parade. And he becomes convinced that wealth is mostly about choosing the best asset. He thinks the rich got rich because they spotted the right thing first, the right stock, the right house, the right startup, the right market, the right currency, the right trade. That is a childish understanding of wealth. It is the sort of understanding that forms when people see the ending of somebody else's journey and mistake it for the beginning. I have spent my whole life around capital, and the truth is much plainer than people want it to be. Wealth does not come first from picking the best thing. It comes from building the right order. If the order is wrong, even a good investment stays too small to matter. Even a strong return fails to change your life. Even discipline can produce frustration, because the machine underneath it is still weak. That is what most people do not understand. They are trying to multiply before they have built anything worth multiplying. They want passive income while their active life is still disorganized. They want ownership before they have surplus. They want leverage before they have stability. They want cash flow before they have skill. They want financial freedom while their calendar still belongs to errands, emergencies, distractions, random spending, and the 1,000 small leaks that make an ordinary life feel busier than it is productive. That is why so many people work hard for years, read about money, try some investments, and still remain strangely stuck. Not because they are lazy, not because they are stupid, because they are trying to enter the wealth ladder from the wrong rung. That is what I want to talk about. Not because I enjoy giving people rules. I do not. Rules are only useful when they reveal structure. A great many modern financial confusions begin disappearing. If I were starting from the beginning again, if I had to explain to a young person or a middle-aged person or any person still building from effort rather than living from accumulated capital, I would say something that sounds too boring to impress anybody, and therefore is probably true. You do not become rich by buying the best investment first. You become rich by buying. That is how it works. The first purchase is not an asset. That disappoints people immediately. They want the conversation to begin with the market, because the market feels exciting and adult and sophisticated. Fine. The market can wait. For most people, the first thing to buy is time. Without time, every other plan is theater. A person says he wants to build, but when you study his day closely, you discover that his life has no spare runway in it. He wakes late because he slept badly. He rushes out the door. He forgets one thing and drives back. He loses 40 minutes to random phone use before breakfast. He answers messages that did not matter. He lets interruptions choose the shape of his work. He runs errands separately because he never grouped them intelligently. He pays bills manually because he never automated what should have been invisible. He shops in fragments. He cooks in fragments. He lives in fragments. Then in the evening he tells himself he was too busy to build anything meaningful. That is not always true. Very often he was too fragmented. Fragmentation is expensive. I learned long ago that the first real leverage available to ordinary people is not borrowed money, and it is not a secret stock tip. It is concentrated time. A man with 2 uninterrupted hours a day for 5 years can build something astonishing compared to a man with no such hours for 15. That is not motivational poetry. That is arithmetic. The modern world has created a curious form of poverty that many people do not recognize because it is often attached to phones, subscriptions, conveniences, takeout boxes, full calendars, and respectable employment. It is attention poverty. The person has enough money to survive, enough obligations to remain tired, enough stimulation to remain mentally busy, and almost no consistent block of unbroken time with which to build the next stage of life. That is a terrible place from which to try compounding. Compounding requires repetition. Repetition requires available hours. Available hours require friction removal. This is why I say the first purchase is time. That does not mean dramatic lifestyle fantasies. It means something much humbler and more useful. Automate the bills, simplify the food pattern, batch the errands, turn off the junk signals. Stop checking the phone as if it were an employer with moral authority over your attention. Use delivery where the math and your income make sense. Pay for little bits of convenience that return hours rather than just comfort. Most people think these are indulgences. They are not used properly. They are tiny acquisitions of future productive capacity. A man who buys back 10 hours a week is not spending. He is reclaiming an asset. If those 10 hours are then wasted, that is another problem. But without the hours, there is nothing to deploy. People love to lecture others about frugality while ignoring the cost of a chaotic calendar. I have no interest in that kind of thrift. Cheapness that protects dollars while burning years is not intelligence. It is clerical self-harm. You must first create space, because wealth building does not occur in leftovers. It occurs in defended blocks of attention. Now, after time comes the second purchase, and again it is not an investment in the ordinary sense. You buy earning power. I mean a high-income skill. The world is full of people trying to invest from scarcity. They put $100 here, $200 there, $300 on a very good month, and then ask why the results still feel microscopic. The answer is obvious, because the number being multiplied is still too small. Investing does not create wealth out of thin air. It multiplies surplus. That is the rule. And if you have not yet become skilled enough to generate meaningful surplus, then the market is not your main bottleneck. Your bottleneck is income creation. This is the part many people resist because it is not glamorous. They want to skip the apprenticeship and arrive directly at ownership. They want the reward without first becoming valuable enough to feed it. That is like planting a magnificent orchard in soil you never bothered to water. A high-income skill is not just a higher-paying job title. It is a capability that moves you closer to revenue. That scales better than the raw hours you sell. And that remains in demand even when the economy becomes less forgiving. I have always liked being close to the money, not emotionally, mechanically. The closer your work sits to actual revenue creation or actual cost reduction, the easier it becomes for the world to justify paying you more sales. Negotiation, deal-making, direct response marketing, distribution building, client acquisition, operations that reduce waste at scale, product design attached to real demand, software tied to business outcomes. The exact skill is not the point. The economic position of the skill is the point. A great many people spend years polishing abilities. The market only rewards politely. Then they feel insulted when their income behaves politely as well. That is not injustice. That is misalignment. You must be useful in a way that pays. And if you are not yet useful in that way, then one of the smartest purchases you can make is not a stock at all. It is training, tools, courses, mentorship, reps, projects that force competence, a better workstation, a program that sharpens your commercial usefulness, books that clarify the rules of a field where money actually moves. Again, many people call this spending. It is not. When bought intelligently, it is income expansion. That is the phrase I prefer. Not education in the vague moral sense people use to flatter themselves. Income expansion. If I spend $1,000 improving a capability that lets me earn $20,000 more each year, that was not an expense in any ordinary way. It was a bargain. Too many people will deny themselves that bargain while happily financing a car upgrade that changes nothing important about the next decade of their earning power. That is upside down. You should spend aggressively on becoming more valuable and cautiously on looking more successful than you are. A person who buys visible proof before buying earning power is building a fragile life. Now, once you have bought time and increased your earning capacity, the next thing you need is something even more neglected. Distribution. I am not using the word in some mystical internet, marketing way. I mean a system that makes it easier for the right opportunities, customers, clients, employers, or partners to find you repeatedly. This is where many competent people remain poorer than they should be. they have skill, they work hard, they are not useless, they are invisible. And the invisible skilled person is one of the saddest financial characters in the modern economy, because he keeps wondering why talent is not enough. Talent is not enough because the market cannot reward what it cannot find. That sounds harsh. It is merely true. There are millions of capable people whose work stays trapped inside small circles because they never built a channel through which attention and trust could travel back to them. A newsletter can be distribution. A YouTube channel can be distribution. A body of work online. A small but consistent social presence where you teach something useful. A local referral loop, intentionally designed, paid ads when the economics justify it. A reputation inside a niche where your name triggers trust before the conversation starts. That is distribution. And distribution matters because it changes pricing power. The invisible person usually takes the price available. The visible trusted person can choose. Choice is one of the most underrated financial assets in the world. When you need every deal, every client, every job offer, every project, your negotiating position is weak. When opportunities arrive repeatedly, you can say no. And the ability to say no is where money often begins changing shape. I do not mean that in a moral sense. I mean it mechanically. You earn more because you are no longer desperate. You choose better because you are no longer starved. You preserve time because you can reject low-quality demands. That is what distribution buys. Again, most people want to skip this rung because it seems slow and uncertain. But the person who owns time, a stronger income engine, and a distribution channel is becoming something very different from an ordinary worker. He is becoming an economic system, and this is where the next purchase becomes possible. The fourth purchase is the cash flow machine. Now, we are closer to what people think wealth building looks like, but still not quite in the way they imagine. Most people think they need passive income because they are tired of active work. That is a bad reason to chase any structure. Exhaustion is not strategy. A cash flow machine is not a fantasy escape hatch. It is a system that reliably turns effort, skill, and market demand into surplus after life is paid for. That distinction matters because not all revenue produces freedom. Some revenue simply keeps the lights on in a more expensive room. A real cash flow machine has repeatability, predictability, the ability to keep selling or keep collecting with less dependence on your direct minute physical presence. This can take many forms: a productized service sold again and again, an agency with recurring retainers, a small business with stable demand, a software tool people pay for monthly, a media business with durable sponsorship economics, an education business with strong margins and recurring inbound trust, a local service machine with systems and people, not just the owner running faster. The exact form is less important than the economic shape. A cash flow machine should not need constant heroics to remain alive. It should produce something like monthly or quarterly surplus with enough regularity that you can plan around it. That is what changes the game. When money arrives unpredictably, fear remains in charge. When money arrives repeatedly from a system rather than only from your body, planning becomes possible. And planning is where capital accumulation accelerates. A person living from invoices may appear successful and still remain fragile. A person who has built a machine that keeps paying while he sleeps, or at least while he is not directly present, has crossed into different territory. He is still working. Do not romanticize it. But he is no longer selling only labor. He is starting to own a process. That is the key. Ownership of process comes before ownership of markets for most people. It also teaches something invaluable. Surplus. Surplus is one of the great dividing lines in all of finance. Without surplus, there is no capital accumulation. Without capital accumulation, investing remains decorative. Without investing, time remains tethered to labor. That is why the cash flow machine matters so much. It is the engine that feeds the eventual portfolio. It is the bridge between work and ownership. Now, only after these 4 purchases do I think you are really ready for the 5th ownership itself. This is where people usually begin the conversation, because this is where the visible glamour lives. Stocks, real estate, private businesses, equity, capital gains, cash distributions, the whole category people now associate with wealth, fine. But by the time you arrive here properly, you will no longer think about ownership the way amateurs think about it. You will not ask, what is the hottest thing to buy? You will ask, what stack of ownership should I build from safest and broadest to most concentrated and demanding? That is a very different mindset. The first layer of ownership for most people should be broad. I like broad index exposure because it lets you own the productive engine of the economy without needing to predict which one company will dominate every cycle. You are not picking a champion horse, you are buying the field of serious enterprise. This is not thrilling. Good. Thrilling is overrated. Broad, low-cost ownership works because the world keeps producing winners and the index keeps letting them matter more over time. You do not need prophecy. You need patience and continuing surplus to feed the machine that is much more realistic. The second layer may be real estate, but only if the math is honest. I do not worship real estate. I respect it when it deserves respect. A cash-flowing property with strong fundamentals, sensible leverage, real demand, and a margin that survives reality can be a very good form of ownership. A romantic property bought on thin numbers because someone online called real estate passive is not the same thing. Leverage cuts two ways. Inflation can help a well-financed owner. It can also expose a weak one. Again, the order matters. A person who has time, earning power, distribution, and a cash flow machine is much better equipped to own real estate than a person who simply wants out of his job and thinks a duplex will save him. The third layer may be equity in businesses other than your own. This could be private deals, partnership stakes, minority ownership in local operating businesses. It could also mean public equity in stronger focused ways if your competence supports it. Now, we are moving from broad ownership of the whole system into more selective ownership of specific engines. The upside can be larger. So can the need for judgment. Then finally comes the strongest and hardest form of ownership, buying or building whole businesses. This is where wealth becomes forceful, because now you are not just receiving a yield from some distant structure. You are controlling pricing, systems, hiring, capital allocation, and the basic mechanics of how value is created and distributed. This is powerful. It is also not the place where a person should begin simply because it sounds glamorous. The person who begins here without the earlier rungs often confuses control fantasies with economic strength. That ends badly. Now, after laying out the ladder, I want to tell you where most people, that is the real problem. They try to buy ownership before they have surplus. They try to build a portfolio before they have cash flow. They try to speculate before they have skill. They try to buy a rental property while their life is still too disorganized to protect a weekly planning block. They talk about passive income while they still have no system feeding investable capital every month. They speak about leverage while their calendar is still a hostage situation. This is what keeps people stuck. Not the absence of information, the wrong order. They are trying to multiply before they have built a machine worth multiplying. And when the multiplication disappoints, they say investing does not work. Investing was not the problem. The sequence was, this is why I keep returning to the first purchase, time. Because time is the master leverage. A person with 2 to 3 focused hours a day for a year will pass the person who is perpetually busy for 5. Not because he is smarter, because he can build. Building requires continuity. Continuity requires protected time. Protected time requires a life not entirely owned by friction. That is where it starts. Then comes skill, because once you have time, you need a way to turn attention into higher hourly value. Then distribution, because hidden talent remains underpriced talent. Then the machine, because surplus must become repeatable. Then ownership, because ownership is what finally detaches the future from pure labor. That is the right order. You can break yourself trying to skip it. People do. Now, let me say something many people need to hear. There is no shame in learning where you actually are. In fact, that honesty is one of the most valuable financial traits you can possess. If you are still fighting for time, say so. If you are still underskilled relative to what the market pays well, say so. If nobody knows your work exists, say so. If you have no system producing surplus, Say so. These are not, they are coordinates. Without coordinates, you cannot build intelligently. Pretending you are at the ownership stage while you are still at the fragmentation stage is one of the fastest ways to waste years. A person trying to invest his way out of a time problem usually remains poor. A person trying to buy real estate his way out of a skill problem often gets humbled. A person trying to speculate his way out of a cash flow problem usually discovers that volatility is not a rescue plan. I prefer clarity. Clarity can feel humiliating for a moment. Confusion steals decades, and decades are too expensive to donate to ego. There's another thing I want you to notice. Every stage in this order makes the next stage easier. That is what a real wealth system looks like. Time makes skill acquisition possible. Skill increases income. Income plus visibility creates distribution. Distribution helps produce reliable opportunity. Reliable opportunity can be shaped into a cash flow machine. The cash flow machine creates surplus. Surplus buys ownership. Ownership then begins creating income that is less directly tied to your hours. That is how you cross from labor to capital. Not with one magical leap, with a series of correct purchases made in sequence. One strengthens the next. This is what people miss when they talk about hustle. Hustle without order is expensive motion. The point is not to work hard in every direction. The point is to build a ladder where each rung actually carries weight. This is also why the wrong purchases are so destructive. There is one category of purchases that keeps people stuck for years: proof purchases, things bought to communicate something to the world rather than to strengthen the machine. A car that proves progress, an apartment that proves taste. A trip financed mainly because the photographs will suggest a life phase you want other people to believe you have entered. Clothes that prove arrival, subscriptions that prove sophistication, status dinners, vanity gadgets, visible comfort that outruns invisible structure. These are not evil. They are simply too expensive relative to what they buy. They purchase applause from people who are not going to fund your future. That is a bad trade. Poor people sometimes buy status because status is one of the few luxuries available immediately. The middle class often buys comfort because comfort feels like earned relief. The wealthy, if they are truly wealthy in the intelligent sense, buy leverage. That is the difference. Leverage is not just debt. Leverage is anything that makes every future effort more effective. Time is leverage. Skill is leverage. Distribution is leverage. Systems are leverage. Ownership is leverage. A proof purchase does the opposite. It consumes current capital while rarely increasing future earning power or future cash flow. That is why it is dangerous. Not because pleasure is forbidden, because proof is expensive and usually sterile. It does not reproduce. The right purchases reproduce. That is how I think about capital. Now, everything I buy with serious money must answer one question. Will this make future value creation easier, faster, larger, safer, or more repeatable? If the answer is no, I become much less interested. I do not need every dollar to be joyless. That would be a stupid life. I do want the large decisions governed by something stronger than mood, because moods fade and the cost of serving them often remains. That is how people wake up in their 40s with decent earnings, a nice exterior, and not much actual machine underneath it all. They spent their best capital buying years proving instead of building. That is sad. But it is reversible earlier than most people think, if they are willing to get honest. The solution is never to feel guilty about the wrong purchases forever. The solution is to begin making stronger ones. Now buy back the hours, buy capability, buy visibility, buy repeatability, then buy ownership. That is how you get free. Not overnight. I distrust overnight. Overnight wealth is often tomorrow's regret wearing tonight's perfume. The kind of freedom I care about is slower and much harder to shake. It is built by correct order. If you build the order correctly, the returns are not only financial, you think differently. A person with time thinks differently from a person always rushing. A person with skill thinks differently from a person always pleading. A person with distribution thinks differently from a person always chasing. A person with a machine thinks differently from a person always improvising. And a person with ownership thinks differently from a person whose entire future still depends on what somebody else is willing to pay him next month. That mental shift is part of wealth too. Wealth is not just the money. It is the reduction in dependence, the increase in choices, the widening of time, the ability to say no, the ability to wait, the ability to think longer than the bill cycle. That is what the latter is really buying. Not a title, not a badge, not a more flattering profile. It buys distance from fragility. And that is one of the finest things money can do. So if you ask me what to buy first, I will disappoint anyone hoping for a ticker symbol. Buy time, then buy the skill that raises your hourly value, then buy the attention system that lets opportunities find you, then buy the machine that throws off repeatable surplus, then, and only then, begin stacking ownership with seriousness. That is the order. And if you respect the order, one day you may discover something wonderful. The life you wanted from investments was never really created by the investments alone. It was created by the sequence that made those investments finally matter.